If you're watching this video, it's because you feel like you're being used, manipulated, or disrespected, and you can't understand why. Here's the brutal truth that no one wants to tell you. Every single day, you're being manipulated by people you trust most. Your boss, your friends, your family, even strangers on the street have learned to push your buttons and make you dance to their tune. And the worst part, you don't even realize it's happening. In the next 40 minutes, I'm going to completely shatter your illusions about control and show you exactly how to become psychologically untouchable using the battle-tested secrets of a man who went from being literally owned by other human beings to becoming the master of his own mind and the teacher of emperor. This ancient wisdom worked 2,000 years ago when life was brutal and unforgiving, and it will work for you today in our modern psychological warfare. Let me tell you about the most mentally invincible human being who ever lived. Epictetus was born around 50 AD in what is now Turkey, and from the moment he took his first breath, he was property, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but literally the legal property of another human being. His name wasn't even really his own. Epictetus literally means acquired one in Greek. He was a thing, an object, a tool to be used and discarded. For decades, he lived under the absolute power of Roman masters who could beat him, torture him, sell him, or kill him on a whim. He was physically disabled, likely from a leg injury that left him permanently lame, making him even more vulnerable in a world that worshipped physical strength and beauty. Every day of his early life was a masterclass in powerlessness, humiliation, and the brutal reality of being completely at the mercy of others. But here's where the story gets incredible. Instead of being broken by this experience, Epictetus discovered something that his masters, despite all their wealth and power, didn't possess: complete and absolute control over his own mind. He realized that while they could chain his body, torture his flesh, and control his external circumstances, there was a fortress inside his consciousness that remained absolutely impregnable. He spent years developing and refining mental techniques that made him psychologically untouchable. And here's the proof that his methods work. He eventually gained his freedom, became one of the most respected philosophers in the Roman Empire, and his teachings were so powerful that they influenced Marcus Aurelius, who became the most powerful man on earth. The slave became the teacher of emperor. Today, you're going to learn exactly how he did it, and how you can apply his techniques to become mentally invincible in your own life. But first, let's talk about why you need this so desperate. Maybe this sounds familiar. You're in a meeting at work, and somehow you end up volunteering for extra projects you don't want to do. You're in a relationship conversation, and suddenly you're apologizing for things that aren't your fault. You're talking to a salesperson, and you walk out having bought something you never intended to purchase. You get a phone call from family, and hang up feeling guilty about boundaries you know are reasonable. You post something on social media, and immediately start checking for likes and comments, letting strangers' reactions determine your mood for the entire day. You're in social situations constantly worried about what others think, adjusting your behavior to avoid any possible disapproval. This isn't weakness. This isn't lack of character. This is the result of systematic conditioning that started before you could even walk. From birth, you've been programmed to be manipulable. In school, you learned that obedience to authority is more important than critical thinking. The education system taught you to sit still, raise your hand for permission to speak, and never question the curriculum. You learned that your worth is determined by external validation, grades, teacher approval, peer acceptance. Social media amplified this 1,000 times over, creating dopamine addiction cycles that make you desperate for likes, comments, and shares. You've been trained to measure your value by how others respond to you. The workplace continues this conditioning, teaching you that compliance is rewarded and independence is punished. Modern society has convinced you that being agreeable, accommodating, and conflict avoidant makes you a good person, when in reality, it makes you the perfect target for anyone who understands basic psychology. And here's what's truly insidious about modern manipulation. It's become so sophisticated and pervasive that most people don't even recognize it anymore. Traditional advice about confidence and assertiveness is not only useless, it actually makes you more vulnerable. When you fake confidence without genuine inner strength, you're broadcasting your insecurity to everyone around you. When you try to be assertive without understanding the psychology of influence, you come across as aggressive and defensive, which actually invites more manipulation attempts. The self-help industry has sold you surface-level solutions that treat symptoms while ignoring the disease. They've taught you to put band-aids on bullet wounds. This is where Epictetus becomes your secret weapon. See, most people who teach about mental strength have never faced real adversity. They've never had their back against the wall with no way out. Epictetus wasn't some privileged philosopher theorizing about life from an ivory tower. He was a man who lived through the absolute worst that human beings can do to each other, and not only survived, but thrive. His techniques weren't developed in comfortable academic settings. They were forged in the fires of real suffering and tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable. When you learn from someone who faced literal life and death psychological warfare and emerged victorious, you're getting strategies that actually work in the real world. The moment that changed everything for Epictetus happened during one of his darkest periods as a slave. His master was torturing him, trying to break his spirit and force complete submission. But instead of breaking, something clicked in Epictetus's mind. He realized that while his master could control his body, his circumstances, and his external reality, there was one thing that remained completely beyond anyone's reach: his ability to choose his response. In that moment of revelation, he discovered what would become the foundation of Stoic psychology and the key to absolute mental freedom. He understood that external events, no matter how painful or difficult, only have the power you give them through your interpretation and response. This realization led him to develop 3 core principles that transformed him from a powerless slave into a mentally invincible human being. These same principles, when properly understood and applied, will make you psychologically untouchable in every area of your life. But before we dive into these life-changing principles, I need you to understand something crucial. Knowledge without action is worthless. Throughout this video, I'm going to give you specific exercises and challenges. Don't just listen passively. Pause the video when I tell you to. Do the exercises and commit to implementing what you learn. This isn't entertainment, it's a blueprint for mental freedom. Principle 1, the fortress of what's truly yours. Epictetus discovered that all human suffering comes from trying to control things that are fundamentally outside our control, while neglecting the things that are actually within our power. He developed what became known as the dichotomy of control, which he considered the foundation of all wisdom and mental peace. According to Epictetus, everything in existence falls into one of 2 categories: things that are up to you and things that are not up to you. Things that are up to you include your judgments, your decisions, your values, your responses, your effort, and your choices about where to focus your attention. Things that are not up to you include other people's opinions, the past, the future, natural disasters, economic conditions, your physical appearance, other people's behavior, and the consequences of your actions. Here's the revolutionary part. Epictetus taught that you should care deeply about the first category and be completely indifferent to the second. This doesn't mean being emotionally numb or uncaring. It means recognizing that your mental energy and emotional investment should go only toward things you can actually influence. When his Roman masters would threaten him with beatings, exile, or death, Epictetus would respond with complete calm because he understood that their threats concerned things outside his control. He couldn't control their action, but he could control his response. He couldn't control whether they hurt his body, but he could control whether they disturbed his peace of mind. Let me give you a modern example of how powerful this principle is. Imagine you're in a job where your boss constantly criticizes your work, takes credit for your ideas, and makes your life miserable. Most people would either suffer in silence, constantly stressed and angry, or they would quit impulsively without a plan. Both responses give away your power. The Stoic approach would be to identify exactly what you can and cannot control in this situation. You cannot control your boss's behavior, personality, or management style. You cannot control company politics or the unfairness of the situation, but you can control how you interpret his behavior, how you respond to criticism, how you document your work, how you network within and outside the company, how you develop your skills, and ultimately, whether you stay or leave and under what conditions. When you apply this principle correctly, something magical happens. You stop wasting emotional energy on things you can't change and channel all your power toward things you can influence. You become significantly more effective because you're not dispersing your efforts across impossible tasks. You become emotionally resilient because your peace of mind isn't dependent on external circumstances. And here's the most important part. You become very difficult to manipulate because manipulators rely on your desire to control things outside your power. Think about the last time someone successfully manipulated. I guarantee they used one of these strategies. They threatened to withhold something you wanted but couldn't control, like their approval, affection, or cooperation. They made you feel responsible for their emotions or behavior. They convinced you that you could control outcomes that were actually outside your influence, or they triggered your fear about future events you couldn't predict or control. Every single manipulation tactic depends on your confusion about what is and isn't within your power. Here's your first practical exercise, and I want you to do this right now. Pause this video, get a piece of paper, and write down the biggest source of stress or frustration in your life right now. Now draw a line down the middle of the paper. On the left side, write everything about this situation that is truly within your control. On the right side, write everything that is outside your control. Be brutally honest. Most people discover that 80 to 90% of their stress comes from obsessing over things in the right column while neglecting opportunities in the left column. From now on, when you feel manipulated, stressed, or powerless, come back to this exercise. It will save your sanity and give you back your power. Principle 2, the art of emotional detachment. This is where Epictetus truly became a psychological genius. He discovered that most manipulation happens through emotional hijacking. People control you by triggering strong emotional reactions that bypass your rational thinking. When you're angry, afraid, guilty, or desperately seeking approval, you make decisions that serve other people's interests instead of your own. Epictetus developed techniques to maintain emotional equilibrium regardless of external circumstance, making him virtually immune to psychological manipulation. The key insight is this: emotions are not caused by external events, they're caused by your interpretations of events. Epictetus famously said, "It's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters." This doesn't mean suppressing emotions or pretending not to care about anything. It means recognizing that you have far more control over your emotional state than you realize, and that emotional reactions are choices, not automatic responses. When Epictetus was being insulted, threatened, or abused by his masters, he would practice what he called objective representation. Instead of thinking, "This person is attacking me," which would trigger anger and defensiveness, he would think, "This person is making certain sounds with their mouth and moving their face in particular ways." Instead of, "This is terrible and unfair," he would think, "This is what's happening right now." This technique, which modern psychology calls cognitive reframing, allowed him to observe situations without being emotionally hijacked by them. Here's how this applies to modern manipulation. Let's say someone is trying to make you feel guilty for setting a boundary. Most people would either cave to avoid the guilt or get angry and defensive, both of which give the manipulator exactly what they want. The Stoic approach is to recognize what's happening. This person is attempting to use guilt as a tool to change my behavior. Once you see the manipulation clearly, without emotional charge, you can respond strategically instead of reactively. I want to teach you a specific technique that Epictetus used, which I call the observer's perspective. When someone is trying to manipulate you emotionally, imagine that you're a scientist observing an interesting experiment. You might think, "Fascinating. This person is using technique number 3 from the manipulation playbook, artificial urgency combined with emotional blackmail. Let me observe how this unfolds." This mental shift immediately removes the emotional charge from the situation and puts you back in control. Another powerful technique is what Epictetus called temporal distancing. When someone triggers a strong emotional reaction, ask yourself, will this matter in 10 years? Will it matter in 10 months? Will it matter in 10 days? Most manipulation relies on making temporary situations feel permanently important. By expanding your time perspective, you can see through the artificial urgency that manipulators create. Here's a real-world example. Your romantic partner threatens to leave unless you do something that violates your values or boundaries. In the heat of the moment, this feels like a catastrophe, but applying temporal distancing, you might realize, if this person would leave me for maintaining reasonable boundary, they're not someone I want to build a life with anyway. Short-term discomfort is better than long-term resentment and loss of self-respect. The most powerful aspect of emotional detachment is that it doesn't make you cold or uncaring. It makes you more capable of genuine love and connection. When you're not constantly reactive and defensive, when you're not driven by fear of loss or need for approval, you can relate to others from a place of strength and choice rather than desperation and need. Paradoxically, becoming less emotionally dependent makes you more emotionally available. Practice this starting today. When you feel a strong emotional reaction to something someone says or does, pause and ask yourself 3 questions. First, what interpretation am I placing on this event? Second, is there another way to interpret this that would be more useful? Third, what response would serve my long-term interests and values? This simple process will save you from countless manipulation attempts and reactive mistakes. Principle 3, converting pain into power. This is where Epictetus transcended normal human psychology and achieved something approaching superhuman mental strength. Instead of simply enduring hardship, he learned to use every difficult experience as training for greater resilience and wisdom. He called this the discipline of desire, and it's perhaps the most counterintuitive yet powerful psychological technique ever developed. The basic principle is this: instead of hoping for easy circumstances, welcome difficult ones as opportunities to develop strength. Instead of avoiding people who challenge you, seek them out as training partners. Instead of cursing obstacles, Thank them for the chance to grow. This doesn't mean being masochistic or seeking out unnecessary suffering. It means recognizing that difficulty is inevitable in life, and you can either be weakened by it or strengthened by it, depending on your mindset. When Epictetus's masters would devise new forms of psychological torture, he would thank them silently for providing advanced training in mental resilience. When other slaves would break under pressure, he would study their failures to identify his own potential weaknesses. When he was punished for maintaining his dignity, he would celebrate internally because he was proving to himself that his values were stronger than their threats. This practice transformed him from a victim into a psychological warrior who actually became stronger through adversity. Here's how this applies to manipulation in your life. Every person who tries to manipulate you is actually giving you a free training session in mental strength. The coworker who constantly tries to dump their responsibilities on you is teaching you boundary setting skill. The family member who uses guilt to control your decisions is helping you develop immunity to emotional blackmail. The romantic partner who threatens to leave when they don't get their way is showing you exactly what unconditional self-respect looks like. I want to share a story that illustrates this perfect. There was a businessman who had an employee who constantly challenged his decision, questioned his authority, and made his life difficult. Instead of firing this employee or becoming frustrated, he started thinking of him as his personal trainer for leadership skill. Every interaction became an opportunity to practice staying calm under pressure, communicating more clearly, and leading with confidence rather than authority. Within 6 months, this businessman had developed such strong leadership skills that he was promoted to a much higher position. The difficult employee had unknowingly been his greatest teacher. This principle works because it completely reverses the power dynamic in any manipulation attempt. When someone tries to hurt, control you, or break you down, and you respond by becoming stronger, they lose all their power over you. They expect you to be weak, discouraged, or defeated. When you're actually strengthened by their efforts, they become confused and eventually give up. But here's the most important part. This isn't about enduring abuse or staying in toxic situations. It's about extracting maximum value from whatever situation you're in while working to improve your circumstances. If you're in an abusive relationship, the training isn't to tolerate abuse better. It's to develop the strength and clarity needed to lead. If you're in a manipulative work environment, the training isn't to accept manipulation. It's to build the skills and resources needed to find better opportunity. Let me give you a specific protocol for implementing this principle. Every time you encounter manipulation, difficulty, or opposition, ask yourself, what skill is this situation trying to teach me? Maybe it's patience, maybe it's boundary setting, maybe it's communication, maybe it's strategic thinking. Then commit to mastering that skill through the challenge you're facing. Keep a journal of these lessons and track your progress. You'll be amazed at how quickly you develop psychological strength when you approach challenges this way. Now, I want to address something crucial that most people get wrong about mental strength. There's a difference between being manipulated and being strategically flexible. True strength sometimes means adapting your approach, compromising on tactics while maintaining your core values, or choosing your battles wisely. The goal isn't to be rigid or combative. It's to ensure that your choices are based on your own judgment rather than someone else's agenda. Epictetus taught his students to distinguish between what he called external goods and internal goods. External goods include money, status, approval, comfort, and pleasure. These things are nice to have, but they're not essential for happiness or self-respect. Internal goods include wisdom, courage, justice, self-discipline, and integrity. These are the things that actually determine your character and life satisfaction. Manipulators almost always offer external goods in exchange for compromising internal goods. They'll offer you money, approval, comfort, or pleasure if you'll sacrifice your values, dignity, or autonomy. The key to being unmanipulable is being genuinely indifferent to external goods. This doesn't mean not enjoying them when they come. It means not needing them for your sense of worth or happiness. When you truly don't need other people's approval, they can't manipulate you with the threat of withdrawing it. When you're genuinely comfortable with simple living, they can't control you with promises of luxury. When you're at peace with yourself, they can't destabilize you with criticism or rejection. Here's where we need to pause and do some serious self-reflection. I want you to honestly examine your own vulnerability to manipulation. What external things do you desperately want or fear losing? Is it your job, your relationship, your social status, your family's approval, your physical comfort? Make a list of these things, because these are your weak points that manipulators will target. Now here's the hard truth. As long as you desperately need these external things, you will be manipulable. The path to freedom requires gradually reducing your psychological dependence on them. This doesn't mean not caring about your job, relationships, or family. It means caring about them in a healthy way that doesn't compromise your integrity or autonomy. Let me share the most effective technique I know for building this kind of independence. It's called voluntary discomfort, and it was one of Epictetus's core practices. Regularly expose yourself to small, manageable doses of the things you fear. If you're afraid of disapproval, occasionally express unpopular opinions. If you're afraid of financial insecurity, practice living on less money than you need. If you're afraid of social rejection, spend time alone. If you're afraid of physical discomfort, take cold showers or exercise intensely. This practice builds confidence that you can handle whatever life throws at you, which makes you psychologically unshakable. Now let's talk about recognizing manipulation in real time. Most people miss manipulation because they're looking for obvious attacks, when the most effective manipulation is subtle and feels helpful or caring. Manipulators have evolved far beyond crude threats and obvious lies. Modern manipulation often comes disguised as concern, love, helpfulness, or even logic. Here are the subtle signs that someone is trying to manipulate you. First, artificial urgency. They insist you need to decide immediately, don't give you time to think or consult others, or claim that waiting will result in lost opportunity. Real opportunities can usually withstand a reasonable amount of consideration time. Second, emotional escalation. They become increasingly upset, dramatic, or intense when you don't immediately comply with their requests. Genuine communication remains relatively calm even when discussing important issues. Third, guilt and obligation tactics. They remind you of past favors, emphasize how much they've done for you, or make you feel selfish for considering your own needs. Healthy relationships involve mutual support without keeping score or using past kindness as leverage. Fourth, isolation attempts. They discourage you from talking to friends, family, or other trusted advisors about important decisions. They may say things like, "This is between us," or "other people wouldn't understand." Legitimate requests usually improve with outside perspective and consultation. Fifth, moving the goalposts. Even when you meet their initial request, they add new conditions or requirements. This is a classic technique to keep you in a cycle of trying to please them without ever achieving their approval. Sixth, false dichotomies. They present complex situations as having only two options, usually with one option being clearly unacceptable. Real life almost always involves multiple possible approaches and solutions. Seventh, love bombing followed by withdrawal. They alternate between excessive affection, attention, or praise, and periods of coldness, criticism, or distance. This creates an addiction-like cycle where you constantly try to get back to the high periods. Healthy relationships maintain relatively consistent warmth and respect. Here's how to respond when you identify these manipulation tactics. First, slow down the interaction. Say something like, "I need some time to think about this," or "Let me get back to you tomorrow." This breaks the artificial urgency and gives you space to think clearly. Second, seek outside perspective. Talk to someone you trust who doesn't have a stake in the outcome. Often, manipulation becomes obvious when you describe the situation to someone else. Third, clarify what's being asked of you. Manipulators often use vague language that allows them to escalate their demands later. Ask for specific details about what they want and what you can expect in return. Fourth, identify your alternative. Manipulators want you to believe you have no choice but to comply. Almost always, you have more options than they want you to realize. Fifth, check in with your value. Ask yourself whether what's being requested aligns with your core principles and long-term goals. If it doesn't, that's usually enough reason to decline, regardless of the pressure tactics being used. Now let's talk about the most insidious form of modern manipulation: social media and digital manipulation. Your attention is being harvested and sold to the highest bidder every moment you're online. The algorithms are specifically designed to trigger emotional reactions that keep you scrolling, clicking, and consuming. Every notification, every like, every comment is carefully calibrated to create psychological dependency. Here's what's happening to your brain. Social media platforms use variable ratio reinforcement schedules, the same psychological mechanism that makes gambling addictive. You never know when you'll get a like, comment, or share, so your brain releases dopamine every time you check, hoping for that reward. Over time, this creates a cycle where you need increasingly frequent validation to feel normal. The manipulation goes deeper than addiction. These platforms are shaping your thoughts, opinions, and even your sense of reality through selective exposure to information. The algorithm shows you content that confirms your existing beliefs and triggers strong emotional reactions because engaged users are profitable users. You're being systematically divided from people with different viewpoints and fed increasingly extreme content that makes you angry, afraid, or out. Breaking free from digital manipulation requires deliberate action. First, Turn off all non-essential notifications. Every notification is an attempt to hijack your attention away from whatever you're actually trying to focus on. Second, set specific times for checking social media instead of allowing it to interrupt your day randomly. Third, regularly audit who you follow and what content you consume. If an account consistently makes you feel angry, inadequate, or compulsive, unfollow it regardless of how entertaining it might be. Fourth, practice extended periods offline. Start with a few hours and gradually work up to full days without digital input. This helps reset your attention span and reduces your psychological dependence on external stimulation. Fifth, create more content than you consume. Instead of passively scrolling through other people's lives and thoughts, focus on creating value through your own work and relationships. Let's move on to workplace manipulation, which is where many people face their most persistent and damaging manipulation experiences. Toxic work environments are breeding grounds for manipulation because they combine power imbalances, economic pressure, and forced proximity. Understanding workplace manipulation tactics can save your career and mental health. The most common workplace manipulation tactic is what I call responsibility creep. It starts with small requests that seem reasonable, but gradually escalates until you're doing far more work than you're paid for or trained to do. The manipulator uses phrases like, "Just this once, you're so good at this," or "I know I can count on you." Before you know it, you're working nights and weekends while your manipulator takes credit for your efforts. Another tactic is crisis manufacturing. Some managers create artificial emergencies and unrealistic deadlines to keep employees stressed and compliant. When people are constantly in crisis mode, they don't have time to think strategically about their situation or look for better opportunities. They become psychologically dependent on the manager to solve the problems that the manager created. Then there's gaslighting in performance reviews. This involves supervisors questioning your memory, minimizing your contribution, or denying promises they made. They might say things like, "I never said that, you're being too sensitive," or "That's not how I remember." This technique is designed to make you doubt your own perceptions and become more dependent on their version of reality. Here's how to protect yourself from workplace manipulation. First, document everything important in writing. Send follow-up emails after important conversations, confirming what was discussed and agreed upon. Keep records of your accomplishments, extra work you've done, and any promises made by supervisors. This documentation protects you from gaslighting and responsibility creep. Second, maintain professional relationships outside your immediate team. Having allies and connections throughout the organization makes it harder for one person to control your career trajectory. It also gives you sources of information about opportunity and organizational politics. Third, continuously develop marketable skills and maintain external job prospects. The best defense against workplace manipulation is knowing that you have alternative. When you're confident that you could find another job, you're much less likely to tolerate manipulative behavior. Fourth, set and maintain professional boundaries. This means being clear about your job responsibility, working reasonable hours, and not taking on unlimited additional tasks without appropriate compensation or recognition. Remember, boundaries aren't mean or selfish. They're necessary for sustainable performance. Now let's address relationship manipulation, which can be the most emotionally devastating because it involves people we love and trust. Relationship manipulators often use your affection for them as a weapon against you. They know exactly which emotional buttons to push because you've been vulnerable enough to share your insecurities and fears with. One of the most common relationship manipulation tactics is intermittent reinforcement. This involves alternating between affection and coldness, attention and neglect, approval and criticism. Just like gambling, this inconsistency creates psychological addiction because you never know when you'll receive the positive treatment you crave. Another tactic is emotional terrorism. This involves threatening to hurt themselves, leave the relationship, or do something destructive unless you comply with their demands. They're essentially holding their own well-being hostage to control your behavior. This is particularly effective against people with strong empathy and caregiving instincts. There's also reality revision, where the manipulator constantly changes the story about past events to avoid responsibility or gain advantage. They might deny saying things you clearly remember, claim you agreed to things you never agreed to, or rewrite history to make themselves look better and you look worse. Protecting yourself from relationship manipulation requires strong boundaries and clear communication. First, don't accept responsibility for other people's emotions or choices. You can be compassionate and supportive without being responsible for their happiness or stability. If someone threatens self-harm to control your behavior, that's a sign you need professional help, not compliance with their demands. Second, maintain your independence and outside relationships. Healthy relationships enhance your life without consuming it entirely. If someone requires you to give up friends, hobbies, or personal goals to make them happy, that's manipulation, not love. Third, trust your own perceptions and memories. If someone consistently makes you doubt your own experiences, that's a major red flag. Keep a journal if necessary to maintain clarity about what actually happened in important conversations or situations. Fourth, remember that love doesn't require you to sacrifice your values or well-being. Real love wants you to be your best self, not a diminished version of yourself that's easier to control. Let me give you the 30-day Mental Fortress protocol that will systematically build your immunity to manipulation. This is based directly on the daily practices that Epictetus taught his students, updated for modern challenges. Week 1, Foundation Build. Every morning, spend 5 minutes identifying 3 things that are completely within your control that day, and 3 things that are outside your control but might stress you. Make a conscious decision to focus only on the first category. Throughout the day, every time you feel stressed or manipulated, ask yourself, is this something I can control? If not, practice letting it go. If yes, take immediate action. Every evening, spend 5 minutes reviewing the day. Where did you maintain control over your reactions? Where did you give away your power? What would you do different? This isn't about self-criticism. It's about building awareness and learning from experience. Week 2, Emotional Regulation. Start practicing the observer's perspective. Whenever someone triggers a strong emotional reaction, instead of getting caught up in the emotion, step back mentally and observe what's happening. Interest. This person is trying to make me angry. Let me see how this develops. This mental distance gives you space to choose your response instead of reacting automatically. Practice temporal distancing by asking yourself whether current problems will matter in various time frames. Most manipulation relies on making temporary issues feel permanently important. When you expand your time perspective, you can see through artificial urgency and emotional manipulation. Week 3, Building Independence. Identify your biggest psychological dependency, the external things you feel you absolutely need for happiness or self-worth. This might be approval from certain people, financial security, social status, or physical comfort. Choose one of these dependencies and deliberately expose yourself to small doses of its absence. If you're dependent on approval, express an unpopular opinion. If you're dependent on comfort, take a cold shower or sleep on the floor one night. The goal isn't to become ascetic, it's to prove to yourself that you can be okay without these things. This builds genuine confidence that makes you much harder to manipulate. Week 4, Advanced Techniques. Start practicing what Epictetus called voluntary discomfort. Deliberately choose small hardships that build mental strength. Wake up earlier than you want to. Exercise when you don't feel like. Have difficult conversations you've been avoiding. Fast for a day. Spend time in silence without entertainment. Each of these practices builds your tolerance for discomfort and proves that you can handle whatever life throws at you. When you know you can handle discomfort, threats of discomfort lose their power over you. Throughout all 4 weeks, maintain a daily journal documenting your progress, insights, and challenges. Notice how your responses to manipulation attempts change over time. Most people are amazed at how quickly they develop psychological immunity when they practice these techniques consistently. As you implement this protocol, you'll notice several profound changes in your life. First, people will stop trying to manipulate you as much because they'll sense that their usual tactics don't work on you anymore. Manipulators are like bullies. They prefer easy targets and will usually move on when they encounter genuine resistance. Second, your stress levels will drop dramatically because you'll stop wasting energy on things you can't control. When you focus only on your choices and responses, life becomes much more manageable and peaceful. Third, your decision-making will improve because you'll be responding from a place of clarity and strength rather than fear and reactivity. When you're not constantly worried about others' reactions, you can make choices based on what's actually best for your long-term well-being. Fourth, your relationships will improve because you'll be interacting with people from a position of choice rather than neediness. When you don't desperately need others' approval or affection, you can love and support them without agenda or manipulation. Let me share a transformation story that illustrates how powerful these principles can be. I worked with a man who was constantly being manipulated by his ex-wife regarding their children. She would make last-minute demands, threaten to restrict his access to the kids, and use their children as leverage to get money and compliance. He was miserable, angry, and felt completely powerless. We started by helping him identify what was actually within his control in this situation. He couldn't control his ex-wife's behavior or personality, but he could control how he responded to her demands, how he documented their interactions, and how he sought legal protection for his parental rights. He couldn't control her attempts to manipulate him, but he could control whether those attempts succeeded. Next, we worked on emotional detachment. Instead of reacting with anger or panic to her threats. He learned to observe them objectively. She's using technique number 5, threatening restricted access to create compliance. This mental distance allowed him to respond strategic instead of emotional. Finally, we helped him convert the pain of this situation into power. Every manipulation attempt became training for stronger boundaries and clearer communication. Every false accusation became practice for staying calm under pressure. Every threat became an opportunity to prove to himself that his love for his children was stronger than his fear of conflict. Within 3 months, the entire dynamic changed. His ex-wife stopped using manipulation tactics because they no longer worked. She couldn't trigger emotional reactions that would lead to poor decisions on his part. Their interactions became more businesslike and focused on the children's well-being rather than power struggles. Most importantly, he regained his peace of mind and confidence as a father. This transformation is available to anyone willing to commit to these principles. The key is consistent practice and patience with yourself as you develop new mental habits. Remember, these techniques have been tested for over 2,000 years by people facing far worse circumstances than most of us will ever encounter. As we conclude, I want to leave you with the most important insight from Epictetus's teachings. True freedom isn't the absence of external constraints. It's the presence of internal autonomy. You may not be able to control what happens to you, but you always have complete control over what happens in you. Your thoughts, values, interpretations, and responses belong to you absolutely, and no one can take them away without your permission. When you truly internalize this truth, you become psychologically untouchable, not because you're cold or uncaring, but because your peace of mind and self-respect come from within rather than from external circumstances. You can love deeply without desperation, work hard without being exploited, and engage with others without losing yourself. The slave Epictetus became freer than his masters, not by changing his circumstances, but by mastering his responses to those circumstances. You have the same opportunity. Every day, every interaction, every challenge is a chance to practice psychological freedom. The question is, will you start implementing Principle 1 today? Identify what's really under your control in your biggest current challenge and focus all your energy there. Stop wasting time and emotional energy on things you can't influence. This single shift will begin your transformation from psychological victim to mental warrior. Your journey to becoming unmanipulable starts now. The only question is, how free do you want to be?